We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Earlier in the show, we've been talking about the trials of Donald Trump in New York City. But now I'd like to expand this and talk about rights in general, and specifically the Second Amendment, which I know is my second favorite because my favorites run sequentially. And we're joined again by Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Now, Scott, you wrote a fantastic piece with some exclusive content.
You say so, Mark.
Last
I'll
week.
Accept your judgment there.
You will on fluffy bunnies. No, I'm kidding. On gun rights, and there are three big cases, all centered around Maryland. And
two are Maryland, and one is next door to Maryland in West Virginia.
Yeah, and these cases they're all quite pertinent to the Second Amendment. Protections of Second Amendment rights. Scott, could you give us an overview of this?
This has to do with the legacy of the Bruen decision that the Supreme Court made that really laid the foundation for most of these gun laws in the United States in sort of red state, or rather the opposite of that, the blue state gun laws peeled back. We have a situation where there's a number of states, the minority of states now, that have kind of all these restrictions on particular guns that a person can buy, prohibitions on carrying guns, and basically a general campaign against the lawful use of firearms in their jurisdictions. New York and Maryland are both in that bucket. New Jersey shares it as well, and they're almost all in the Northeast and California. And so these cases are all relevant to those jurisdictions and the Bruen case and how the Supreme Court's going to deal with following up on it. Of the three cases, Mark, one called Bianchi v. Brown, I think, is the most important and interesting, and that is a case about Maryland and whether or not they can restrict, quote-unquote, assault weapons. Now, for those who know, assault weapons are a made-up term that politicians and anti-gunners have used to try to trick Americans into thinking that what the object being banned are fully automatic machine guns, and they're not. They're weapons that look kind of more aggressive or dangerous or whatever the adjective would be. They're known colloquially by those who like them on the internet as EBRs, or evil black rifles. So they don't have the old Elmer Fudd look to them.
If I could just point out, I remember not long ago while I was doing social media for Liberty Nation, that somebody had put a picture saying we need to ban these, and it was a tripod folded up for a camera, and it looked almost like an AR-15.
Right,
Well, obviously it didn't to anybody who knows what an AR-15 looks like, but the reactions underneath were, yes, truly evil. It just really goes to show that people really don't know very much about
Well, I can tell you, too, that as I bore witness to history with this, when these bans were coming on from the early 80s on, the local news stations, before the internet, and that's where most people got their news, the local television news stations would often run stories about gun control, and the B-roll or backdrop that they were showing were machine guns firing when they would talk about assault rifles. Now, whether that was ignorance or prejudice or some combination, I don't
propaganda.
know.
Let's throw that one in there.
But it was definitely not about illuminating the issue. And so, in any case, back to Bianchi v. Brown, this is a case by some Marylanders and some gun dealers who say we should be able to buy and sell guns that are bought and sold every day in Virginia and in Delaware and in Pennsylvania. Somehow in Maryland, they can't be. And that's a violation of the Second Amendment because they are regular, in common use, rather, and not especially deadly. Two of the kind of qualifications to make a firearm to be protected under the First Amendment. But what's kind of extra about this case is the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has had the case for years. They initially decided the issue before the Bruen case came out. Once the Bruen case came out, the Supreme Court accepted a review of this Bianchi case and immediately sent it back down to the Fourth Circuit, to the lower court for instructions to rule on it in light of the Bruen decision. That court assigned it to a 3-judge panel. That's how most cases in our circuit courts are decided, by a 3-judge panel. And here's where the dirt comes in. The speculation is that the majority of, or some significant number of judges on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals heard that three-judge panel was going to issue a ruling that they did not like, a pro-gun ruling, a ruling that would have forced Maryland to respect the civil rights, the Second Amendment rights of its citizens, and stop this ban. And so what they did was they quickly intervened before that ruling could be published and said, "Oh, we're gonna hear this case in an en banc fashion." Okay, E-N, second word, B-A-N-C,
yeah,
and it as a whole. So instead of
15 or 16 judges, right?
Well, in this case, for one of the days, there were two cases argued one day, and there happened to be 15 of the judges in the courtroom for that. And then the second day, the third case was argued, and there were 16 judges. That's for the Bianchi case. And during that argument, the judges revealed a staggering amount of ignorance, both of AR-15s generally, and also they discussed sending it back down to the district court for some factual findings, meaning years on now. And if I didn't complete my thought there, what I wanted to say is, before that three-judge panel could rule, they said, "Oh, we're going to reschedule this for en banc review." So the advocates are waiting. En banc review is something that would occur in a normal case instead of a three-judge panel, not after the completion of a three-judge panel. That's where the stink goes to high heaven in terms of thinking that the fix is in for an anti-gun ruling on this case. And so what we have, Mark, is a rare case where the advocates are asking for a certiorari before judgment. And this came up in the news. So many, so much chance for historical education with these political prosecutions. It came up with Donald Trump's prosecution, but it's asking the Supreme Court to not wait for the Fourth Circuit to be done, and instead to say, "You've had enough time. You're not doing the right thing. We're going to take the extraordinary step of reaching down and snatching this case from you before you rule on it, to make sure that the people of the Fourth Circuit and Maryland, have their rights respected." Well, so that's pending now.
That's a fascinating case, because it seems that the group of judges, by sending it back to a lower court for some factual clarification, what they're really trying to do is just extend the period of time for as long as humanly possible. Sure. And during that time, the Marylanders' rights are presumably being quashed. And so then it would go back to the lower courts. Then it would come back to them, at which point they would either do a three-judge panel of judges that might rule in the correct way, or they'd go for the en banc review again, at which point years could have passed, years more than have already passed already.
And Clarence Thomas retires and is replaced by an anti-gun vote.
But by Kamala Harris or Oprah Winfrey, yes, of course. I
think it's Stedman, actually, who will be.
So, yeah, this really brings to mind something that I hear a lot on let's call them the more left-leaning news outlets. Justice delayed is justice denied.
All you have to do is think of it. So many of these issues, I think, are like this. Just change the issue. Make it the right to a jury trial or the right to free speech or any of the other fundamental rights that our Bill of Rights protects. And I think it's easy for people who aren't in the gun culture to see just how awful that violation is.
So, Scott, you reached out to people involved in bringing this case forward. And what did you learn?
I spoke with David Kopel, who is one of the nation's premier kind of gun rights lawyers. And he actually wrote an amicus brief to the court arguing why they should take this case and grant certiorari before judgment. And he's for the record, he's been quoted by the Supreme Court, or his arguments have been cited by the Supreme Court, I think seven previous decisions. So he's got the goods when it comes to speaking to the court on gun matters, and I'm sure that they take his brief quite seriously, which is why I think it's an important brief. And it just echoes the same arguments about how it's a low-powered weapon. One of the things, it was really shocking, Mark, to listen to. I listened to, I think, all 4.5 hours or so of the oral arguments in Richmond at the Fourth Circuit on these cases, and it was shocking the level of ignorance some of these judges had, and were likening the destructive power of the AR-15 to really a firearm with several orders of magnitude more destructive power than it has. I mean, it was just preposterous, really. The AR-15 fires the 5.56 set in metric terms, or .223 caliber round, which is a low-powered rifle round. It is among the lowest of the rifle calibers or cartridges. So to suggest that it's a high-powered rifle, this is a vestige of, I think, poor reporting on this issue for decades and decades. It's a low-powered rifle, but of course that doesn't sell newspapers or generate outrage. So.
Scott, I think it's quite important to know that, as you point out, the judges seemed quite in the 4.5-hour hearing. It was in Richmond because it's part of the same Fourth Circuit that covers Maryland, right? But the fact that the judges don't have intimate knowledge of this, that kind of reminds me of something that happened very recently while in the Supreme Court, where Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was almost intimating that the First Amendment, the First Amendment ruling would stop the government being able to interfere in social media. And she seemed to have a very poor understanding of what the First Amendment is. Now, surely we're at the same risk here.
Let me just stop you right there and say, just to complete the thought about Mr. Kopel, he provided a handy chart for the justices with bullet weights and energy and muzzle velocity, so they could see plainly what we're talking about here. So I hope that that will kind of control the issue going forward with the Supreme Court. But to Ketanji Brown Jackson, what she said was, she seemed perplexed that one of the advocates was advancing a position whereby the government's desire to restrict free speech was somehow stymied because of the First Amendment. I am speechless, because, of course, precisely that is the point of the First Amendment, to restrict government action to stop free speech. And so that's the entire point of the endeavor. And it didn't seem like a kind of a one-off or a hiccup of the brain, or however you want to call it. It seemed like that was her considered. She sounded like a person who was not grounded in our First Amendment jurisprudence in any meaningful way. That's the disturbing part of it.
So there's a good possibility that if this Bianchi versus Brown makes to the Supreme Court, that we might have one or more justices saying, by your reckoning, if we shut this down, then people will be allowed to own firearms across the country. And that, of course, is clearly not the purpose of the Second Amendment, is it, Scott?
It was troubling, boy.
It's a troubling thought. We'll be back with more troubling thoughts after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.